Texas, 1944. The train lurched to a stop under a sky so vast it swallowed fear whole. Heat shimmered off the rails like liquid glass, distorting the endless horizon where cattle moved like distant dreams. Inside the cattle cars, 12 German women pressed against the wooden slats, hands trembling, expecting chains. They had been told Americans were savages, that female prisoners would face brutality beyond imagining. The doors swung open, dust rose in golden clouds. A rancher in worn denim stood waiting, a bundle of leather in his weathered hands, not shackles, cowboy boots. "You folks will be riding with us," he said, and everything they believed about their enemy began to crack. North Africa, 6 months earlier. The sun beat down on a field hospital tent where German nurses moved between cots, their white uniforms stained with sand and blood. Nurse Elsa Hoffman bent over a wounded soldier, adjusting his bandages, when the canvas flap tore open. British officers stood silhouetted against the blazing light. The war had turned. Rommel's Africa Corps was collapsing, and with it the support units that kept the wounded alive. Elsa straightened her back, felt her heart hammering against her ribs. She had expected this moment for weeks, the moment when being a German in Allied hands would mean facing everything the propaganda had promised. "Gather your things," the British lieutenant said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "You're prisoners of war now." 12 women, nurses mostly, though 2 had been communication specialists and 1 a translator. They ranged from 22 to 38 years old. Some wept. Others stood rigid, holding on to the discipline their training had drilled into them. Elsa watched the wounded German soldiers watching them, their eyes hollow with defeat and something else, worry for what would happen to their caretakers. The ship that carried them across the Atlantic was a converted cargo vessel, its hold transformed into a makeshift prisoner transport. The women were kept separate from the male POWs, housed in a cramped compartment that smelled of salt and rust. Days blurred together in the dim light below deck. They spoke little at first, each woman locked inside her own fear. Greta Muller, the youngest at 22, couldn't stop her hands from shaking. She had joined the nursing corps because her mother told her it was safer than factory work, that the Red Cross armband would protect her. Now that armband meant nothing. "They'll kill us," she whispered one night, her voice barely audible over the engine's constant thrumming. Or worse. The propaganda had been thorough. For years they had been taught that Americans were gangsters and savages, that they showed no mercy to prisoners, particularly women. The stories passed among them in hushed tones, tales of torture, of humiliation, of fates worse than death. None of them had reason to doubt these stories. They had never met an American. Margaret Schneider, the eldest at 38, had worked as a head nurse in Berlin before the war. She had seen the propaganda posters plastered across the city, had heard Goebbels' radio speeches promising that capture meant certain brutality. But she had also treated wounded Allied pilots, had seen the photographs they carried of wives and children, farms and dogs. "We don't know what's waiting," she told the younger women, "but we must survive to find out." When the ship docked in New York Harbor, the women were transferred immediately. No time to see the city's skyline or process the reality of American soil beneath their feet. They were loaded into a train car, not luxurious, but clean, with actual seats rather than the bare floors they had expected. The journey west took 3 days. Guards brought them food at regular intervals. Sandwiches, fruit, coffee that tasted better than anything they'd had in months. The guards were young men, farm boys mostly, who treated them with an awkward politeness that felt more confusing than comforting. "Ma'am," one said, tipping his cap as he handed Elsa a sandwich. She stared at the word, trying to process it. Ma'am, not prisoner, not German, ma'am. Through the windows, America unfolded like a dream. Cities gave way to farmland, farmland to prairie, prairie to something wilder and more open than anything they had imagined. The landscape changed from green to gold to brown, the sky expanding until it seemed to press against the train's roof. They had been taught that America was cities and concrete, factories and filth. This was something else entirely. The train pulled into a small Texas station just after dawn. The heat hit them like a physical force when the doors opened. Dry, intense, nothing like the humid warmth of North Africa. Elsa stepped down onto the platform, her legs unsteady after days of travel, and felt the sun on her face. It felt different here, cleaner somehow. Camp Hearn sat 10 miles outside town, a collection of wooden barracks surrounded by wire fencing and guard towers. But the wire looked almost decorative, and the towers were unmanned in daylight. Beyond the fences, the land stretched endlessly. Rolling hills dotted with mesquite and live oak, cattle grazing in pastures that seemed to have no boundaries. A group of men waited near a truck. Not soldiers, or at least not in the way the women understood soldiers. These men wore denim and leather, wide-brimmed hats that shadowed their faces. Cowboys. Real cowboys, like from the films they'd watched in Germany before the war, when American culture was still permitted, still fascinating. One stepped forward, a man in his 50s with sun-weathered skin and kind eyes. "Welcome to Texas," he said. His accent was strange, musical almost, words drawling in a way that made them sound gentler. "I'm James Crawford. I run the ranch that borders this camp. You folks will be helping out here, feeding, cleaning, riding if you're up for it." Riding. The word hung in the air like something foreign. Elsa glanced at the other women, saw her own confusion reflected in their faces. They had expected labor, yes, hard work in fields or factories. But riding, that was something free people did. The barracks assigned to the women were simple but clean. Each had a bed with actual sheets, a small locker, a window that opened to let in the evening breeze. It wasn't home, but it wasn't the concrete cells they had imagined. That first night, lying in the darkness, Elsa heard Greta crying softly 2 beds over. "They're trying to make us comfortable," Greta whispered when Elsa came to sit beside her. "Before they hurt us. That's what they do, isn't it? Make you trust them first?" Elsa had no answer. The fear was logical, reasonable even, but something about the place felt wrong for cruelty. The guards smiled. The food was plentiful. The work assigned to them, cleaning the mess hall, helping in the camp kitchen, was demanding but not brutal. And everywhere that sky, so wide it made her chest ache. The third morning, they were told to report to the main ranch house at dawn. The women walked the half-mile from camp to house in silence, their boots crunching on gravel, watching the sun paint the horizon in shades of orange and pink they'd never seen in Germany. The air smelled of sage and something else. Bacon, they realized. Meat cooking. James Crawford met them on the porch. "Figured you folks might appreciate a proper breakfast before work," he said. Inside, a table was set with plates and silverware, steaming platters of eggs and bacon, biscuits with butter and jam, coffee in real ceramic cups. The women stood frozen in the doorway. This wasn't prisoner food. This was family food. "Well, come on," Crawford's wife Martha said, waving them in. She was a small woman with gray hair and hands that looked like they'd worked hard for decades. "Food's getting cold." They sat slowly, uncertain, waiting for the trap to spring. But Crawford simply bowed his head, said a brief grace, and started passing plates. "Plenty more where that came from," he said. "We don't believe in letting anyone go hungry, war or no war." Margaret was the first to eat. She lifted a fork with trembling hands, tasted eggs seasoned with pepper and salt, and felt tears slide down her cheeks. Not because the food was good, though it was better than anything she'd eaten in years, but because of the simple, devastating kindness of the gesture. The propaganda had never prepared them for this. A week into their time at Camp Hearn, Crawford showed up at the barracks with boxes under his arms. "Can't have you working in those," he said, nodding at their worn military boots. He opened the boxes to reveal leather cowboy boots, not new but well-maintained, clearly from his own ranch hand's supplies. "These'll fit better for riding. We need help moving cattle tomorrow." Elsa picked up a boot, felt the smooth leather, the weight of it. In Germany, leather goods were rationed, precious. Here, this rancher was giving them boots, real cowboy boots. "Why?" she asked, the English word difficult on her tongue. "Why this?" Crawford studied her for a long moment. "Because you're here, and you need them, and I've got them to give. That's reason enough, isn't it?" That evening, the women sat in the barracks trying on boots, adjusting the fit, running their fingers over the tooled leather. Greta laughed for the first time since North Africa, a sound so unexpected that everyone stopped to stare. She stood up, took a few experimental steps in her new boots, and grinned. "I look like a cowboy," she said in German, then again in broken English. "I look cowboy." Dawn came cool and clear, the sky shifting from black to purple to pale blue. The women gathered at the corral where horses stood waiting, quarter horses, calm and well-trained, chosen specifically for inexperienced riders. Most of the women had never been on a horse. In Germany, horses were military assets or expensive luxuries, not everyday tools. A young cowboy named Tom showed them how to mount, how to hold the reins, how to sit without tensing every muscle. "Horse can feel your fear," he said. "Got to breathe deep, let yourself settle." Elsa's horse was a bay mare named Dolly, 15 years old with patient eyes. When Elsa finally managed to mount, settling into the saddle with Tom's help, she felt the horse shift beneath her, felt the warmth of the animal's body, the power of its breathing. For the first time since the British officers had entered that field hospital tent, she felt something other than fear. She felt alive. They rode out slowly, Crawford and Tom leading them across the ranch's eastern pasture. The cattle needed to be moved to fresh grazing, a simple task that required more presence than skill. The women followed instructions, learning to guide their horses, to read the cattle's movements. The work was hard, the sun brutal, but there was something clean about it, something honest. By midday, Elsa's thighs ached, her back screamed, her hands were raw from gripping reins. But when she looked around at the other women, faces flushed with heat and effort, eyes bright with something like joy, she understood what was happening. They were being given their humanity back, piece by piece, through boots and horses and breakfast eggs. Camp regulations allowed prisoners to write letters, though they would be censored and might never arrive. Still, the women wrote. Margaret crafted careful sentences to her sister in Berlin, trying to explain the inexplicable. "I am treated well," she wrote, "better than I expected, better than I deserve, perhaps, given what our nation has done." That last line she crossed out. It felt dangerous, disloyal, but late at night, lying in her bunk, she let herself think it. She had been a nurse, had taken no part in the fighting, had believed she was serving her country honorably. But the stories she'd heard whispered among the wounded soldiers, stories of camps and trains and things too terrible to name. Those stories felt more real now that she had seen what actual decency looked like. Greta wrote to her mother about the horses. "I rode today, Mama. Can you imagine? Can you? Me on a horse like something from a Karl May novel. The sky here is so big it makes you feel small and important at the same time." Elsa didn't write. She had no family left. Her parents had died in the Hamburg bombings, her brother on the Eastern Front. Instead, she started a diary, filling pages with observations about this strange new world. "The Americans smile at us," she wrote one evening. "Not the tight, forced smiles of people performing duty, but real smiles, like we're people they're glad to know. Don't understand it. We're enemies. They should hate us, but they don't seem to know how." As weeks turned to months, the boundaries between prisoner and captor began to blur in small, significant ways. The women taught the ranch hands German drinking songs during evening gatherings. The cowboys taught them Texas two-step, though the dancing was awkward with only women and old men, the younger cowboys having gone to war. Martha Crawford brought her sewing to the barracks one afternoon, showing the women how to repair their worn clothes using American techniques. In return, Margareta taught her the German method of darning socks, creating nearly invisible repairs that Martha praised as superior to her own work. Food became a bridge. The women showed the camp cook how to make proper German potato salad and sauerbraten. In return, he taught them about Texas barbecue, about the slow art of smoking meat until it fell apart at the touch. These exchanges felt dangerous in their intimacy. Each shared recipe, each taught song, another crack in the wall of propaganda. 3 months into their time at Camp Hearn, news arrived that changed everything. The Normandy invasion had succeeded. Allied forces were pushing into France, then Germany itself. The war that had seemed endless was suddenly ending, and Germany was losing. That night, the women gathered in the barracks, speaking in hushed tones about what this meant. Return home? Trial? Punishment for their nation's actions? The future felt as uncertain as it had that day on the Atlantic crossing. But the next morning, Crawford appeared with spurs. Real cowboy spurs, jangling and bright. "Figured if you're going to keep riding with us, you ought to have these," he said. "War's ending, but the ranch work isn't. You're welcome to stay on as long as you need to. As workers, paid workers, once the prisoner status lifts." Elsa took the spurs, felt their weight, understood what he was offering. Not just work, not just survival. A future. A place in a world that should have rejected them absolutely. As news from Germany grew more detailed, as the full scope of the war's destruction became clear, the women began to understand what they would be returning to. Cities in ruins, millions dead, and worse, much worse, the camps, the death camps, the systematic murder of millions. The American newspapers didn't hide these stories. Photos appeared of liberated concentration camps, of the walking skeletons and mass graves. The camp commander made sure the German POWs saw these images, understood what had been done in their nation's name. The women gathered around the newspapers in shocked silence. "We didn't know," Greta whispered, her face pale. "How could we not know?" But Margaret remembered things now, small things she had chosen not to examine too closely. Jewish colleagues who disappeared from the hospital. Rumors quickly hushed, the way certain topics became forbidden to discuss. "We didn't want to know," she said, her voice hollow. "That's different than not knowing." Crawford found Elsa in the corral one evening, grooming Dolly with methodical strokes that betrayed her inner turmoil. He leaned against the fence, quiet for a long moment, before speaking. "You're wondering if you deserve the kindness we've shown you," he said. It wasn't a question. Elsa's hand stilled on the brush. "My country did terrible things. I wore its uniform. I served its military. How can that not make me guilty?" Crawford took off his hat, turned it in his hands. "My daddy fought in the First War," he said. Came back saying the German soldiers he fought were just boys like him, scared and tired and wanting to go home. Said the real sin was the men who started the war, not the ones who got caught up in it. He paused. "But I reckon you've got to figure out your own answer to that question. All I know is punishing you more won't undo what was done. Maybe teaching you a different way to be is worth more." That conversation stayed with Elsa, working its way through her understanding like water through stone. She had been taught that strength came from hardness, that mercy was weakness. But here was a man who had shown her mercy while his own sons were fighting her countrymen overseas. His strength came from a different source entirely. Martha Crawford invited the women to attend Sunday services in town. It was optional. No one would force them, but several chose to go. They dressed in their best clothes, the civilian dresses that had been provided to replace their tattered uniforms, and rode into town in the back of Crawford's truck. The church was a simple white building with a steeple that pointed toward that endless Texas sky. Inside, the congregation turned to stare as the German women entered. The stares weren't all friendly. Some held anger, grief for sons who hadn't come home, hatred for an enemy that had seemed abstract until now. But the pastor welcomed them from the pulpit. He spoke about forgiveness and redemption, about loving one's enemies not because they deserved it, but because God commanded it. His words were simple, direct, devoid of the complicated theology Elsa had learned in German churches. "These women are prisoners of war," he said. "But more than that, they're children of God. Same as you, same as me. We treat them as such." After the service, an old woman approached Margaret. Her face was carved with grief, her Sunday dress carefully mended. "My boy died at Normandy," she said, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "Killed by German soldiers. You understand that?" Margaret nodded, unable to speak. "I should hate you," the woman continued. "I want to hate you. But my boy wrote to me before he died, said he'd met some German prisoners, Said they were just scared kids like him. Said he hoped someone was treating them decent. She reached out, squeezed Margaretta's hand. So I'm trying. For him, I'm trying. The forgiveness was harder to bear than hatred would have been. May 1945. The war in Europe ended with Germany's unconditional surrender. The women gathered around the radio in the camp's common room, listening to the announcement in German and then in English. It was over. Everything was over. They should have felt relief. Instead, Elsa felt only a profound exhaustion. She thought of her parents' graves in Hamburg, her brother buried somewhere in the frozen Russian soil. She thought of the patients she had nursed, the soldiers who had died under her care. All of it for nothing. All of it for a cause that had led to death camps and destruction. That evening, Crawford organized a bonfire at the ranch. He invited the women, the guards, the ranch hands who had remained too old for military service. Someone brought a guitar. Someone else brought whiskey. They sat under the stars, enemies by law, something else by experience, and tried to make sense of endings. "You'll go home eventually," Crawford said to Elsa. "Might be months yet, but you'll go home." "I don't know if I have a home to return to," Elsa replied. Crawford poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the darkness. "Then I reckon you'll have to build a new one. That's what my grandparents did when they came here from Ireland. Started over in a place that felt foreign until it felt like home." Before the women were scheduled to leave Camp Hearn, Crawford organized one final cattle drive. They rode out at dawn, 12 German women who now sat their horses with confidence, who knew how to work cattle and read the Texas weather. The work took all day, moving the herd to winter pasture, and by evening they were exhausted, filthy, and happy in a way that felt stolen from a different life. They stopped to rest on a ridge that overlooked the ranch's eastern boundary. Below them, the land rolled away in shades of gold and brown, the sunset painting everything in warm light. Dolly stood patient beneath Elsa, her breathing steady, familiar now. "I'll miss this," Elsa said in English that had grown much better over the months. "This space, this sky." Tom, riding beside her, nodded. "Texas gets in your blood," he said. "My daddy came here from Tennessee. Said he'd never seen anything like it. Couldn't leave after that." Elsa looked around at the other women, Greta laughing at something Margaret said, young and alive in a way she hadn't been since North Africa. Margaret herself sitting tall in her saddle, her face peaceful, the others scattered across the hillside, silhouettes against the fading light. They had come here expecting chains and found something they had no words for in any language. The day came in late autumn, when the Texas heat had finally broken into something gentler. The women packed their few belongings, the clothes they'd been given, small gifts from the Crawford family, photos taken on the ranch that showed them smiling in their cowboy boots and hats. Elsa folded her diary carefully, the pages filled with her transformation from prisoner to person. Martha Crawford made breakfast one last time, the table laden with their favorites from the past months. They ate slowly, savoring not just the food but the moment, the knowing that this particular configuration of people would never exist again. "You write to us," Martha said, her voice firm despite the tears. "You let us know you made it home safe, that you're all right." They promised they would, though everyone knew the promises were complicated by distance and different languages and a world that would need years to heal. Crawford drove them to the train station in town. He gave each woman an envelope as they boarded. Money, they discovered later, far more than their labor had earned. For starting over, he had written in simple English on each envelope. Everyone deserves a chance to start over. The train carried them east, retracing the journey they'd made 9 months earlier. But they were different now, transformed by something they still struggled to articulate. They spoke less about what they were returning to and more about what they were leaving behind. "I learned something here," Margaret said, as the train crossed into another state, the landscape changing again. "About what it means to be human. We were told humanity was about strength and purity and domination, but Crawford showed us it's about breakfast and horses and giving someone boots they need." Greta nodded, her fingers tracing the embroidered leather of her cowboy boots. She had refused to pack them, wore them instead, defiant and proud. "When we get home," she said, "when people ask us about America, about being prisoners, how do we explain this?" No one had an answer. How could they explain that their enemy had treated them with more humanity than their own leadership? That cowboys in Texas had defeated Nazi propaganda more thoroughly than any military campaign? The women returned to a Germany that barely existed anymore. Cities were rubble. Millions were displaced, hungry, traumatized. The economic system had collapsed. The political structure was divided between occupying powers. And everywhere, the weight of guilt and shame for what had been done in their nation's name. Elsa returned to Hamburg, to the neighborhood where she had grown up. The street was gone, replaced by ruins and makeshift shelters. She stood in the dust and broken concrete, feeling the weight of loss settle over her like a physical thing. But she also felt something else. The memory of Texas sky, of Crawford's steady kindness, of Martha's breakfast table. She thought about what Crawford had said about his grandparents starting over, building homes in foreign soil. If they could do it, so could she. She found work at a makeshift hospital, tending to the sick and wounded with skills she'd learned in North Africa and compassion she'd learned in Texas. When patients asked about her time as a prisoner, she told them about the horses, about the boots, about the Americans who treated her like a person worth saving. Margaret returned to Berlin, to even worse devastation. But she carried with her a vision of what rebuilding could mean. She worked with refugee organizations, helping displaced persons find shelter and purpose. When the work felt overwhelming, when the scope of destruction seemed too vast to overcome, she remembered Crawford's words, "Everyone deserves a chance to start over." Greta went to Frankfurt, married a British officer she met in the chaos of occupation, and eventually moved to England. But she kept her cowboy boots, kept them polished and displayed. A tangible reminder that even in the depths of war, humanity could surprise you. True to their word, the women wrote to the Crawford family. Letters crossed the Atlantic slowly at first. The postal system was disrupted, mail service unreliable. But they came eventually, carrying news of survival and rebuilding. Martha Crawford saved every letter, stored them in a wooden box in her parlor. She read them aloud to James in the evenings, tracking the women's progress through the ruins of post-war Germany. When Greta wrote about her wedding, Martha cried. When Margaret described the new hospital opening in Berlin, James nodded with satisfaction. When Elsa sent a photo of herself with a group of nursing students she was training, they both felt the chain of kindness extending forward. Years later, when a historian researching POW camps in Texas interviewed the Crawfords, James struggled to explain why they had done what they did. "They needed help," he finally said. "We had the means to help them. Didn't seem complicated to me." But Martha understood the deeper truth. "We had sons overseas," she said. "We hoped someone was treating them decent if they got captured. Seemed like we ought to do the same for these women. Besides, cruelty doesn't end wars. It just plants seeds for the next one. Maybe kindness can plant different seeds." Camp Hearn closed in 1946, its barracks dismantled, its fences removed. The land returned to the Crawfords' ranch, and within a few years, little physical evidence remained that it had ever existed. But the story lived on, passed down through families on both sides of the Atlantic. In Germany, the women who had been prisoners in Texas became bridges between cultures. They spoke at schools about their experiences, about the complexity of war and humanity. They taught their children and grandchildren that enemies can become friends, that propaganda dissolves in the face of genuine kindness, that healing requires seeing the humanity in everyone. In Texas, the Crawford family maintained correspondence with several of the women until death separated them decades later. The letters became family treasures, proof that even in humanity's darkest moments, light could break through. Historians would later note Camp Hearn as an example of successful prisoner rehabilitation. The women who passed through it showed remarkably low rates of continued Nazi sympathy compared to other POW populations. But the statistics missed the essential truth. What happened at Camp Hearn wasn't rehabilitation. It was recognition. Recognition that beneath uniforms and nationalism and propaganda, people remained people, with the same needs for dignity, purpose, and connection. The story of the German women prisoners at Camp Hearn exists now as a footnote in the vast history of World War II. It lacks the drama of battles, the clear moral lines of resistance movements, the satisfying narrative of obvious heroes and villains. But perhaps that's precisely why it matters. Because war is not just battles and strategies. It's also the small moments when people choose kindness over cruelty, connection over division, humanity over ideology. It's cowboys handing boots to women they should hate. It's breakfast at a family table for people society says are enemies. It's the slow, quiet work of dismantling propaganda through the simple act of treating someone with dignity. The Texas sky that seemed so vast to those 12 German women still stretches wide over the land that was once Camp Hearn. The cattle still graze. The mesquite still dots the hills. And somewhere in Germany and England and scattered corners of the world, there may still be people who own a pair of cowboy boots their grandmother received from a Texas rancher in 1944. Boots that changed everything about what she thought she knew of the world. History remembers the generals and the battles, the treaties and the turning points, but it's the small acts of humanity that actually change hearts, that plant the seeds of real peace. James and Martha Crawford never made a history book. They never won medals or received recognition. They simply fed some hungry women, gave them useful work, and treated them like human beings worthy of respect. In doing so, they defeated Nazism more thoroughly than any bomb or bullet ever could. Because in the end, the greatest weapon against hatred isn't force. It's a pair of cowboy boots offered freely, with no expectation of return. And sometimes that changes everything.